How ink adheres to different surfaces. A crucial aspect of ink's function is how it sticks to or marks a given surface. This involves physical processes, like absorption and drying, and sometimes chemical interactions. We'll examine paper, skin, fabric, and plastic, 4 very different substrates, to see how inks work with each. Paper. Most papers are made of wood cellulose fibers pressed into sheets, often with additives, sizing, fillers, that affect absorbency. When ink hits paper, 2 main things happen: absorption into the fibers and binding to the surface. Dye-based inks, like fountain pen or inkjet inks, penetrate paper deeply. Capillary action draws the liquid along the microscopic pores between fibers. The dye molecules may also bond weakly with the cellulose, for instance, via hydrogen bonding or ionic attraction if the paper is treated. Paper is often internally sized with starch or alkyl ketene dimer to limit how much ink spreads. Externally, it might have a coating that can chemically grab dye molecules. One technique is to coat paper with a substance of opposite charge to the dye, so the dye is attracted and held near the surface. For example, inkjet photo paper might have a cationic polymer coating that latches onto anionic dyes, keeping them from feathering. Pigmented inks on paper work a bit differently. The pigment particles mostly stay on the surface or get caught in surface fibers rather than soaking in. They rely on binders in the ink, like resins or polymers, that as the ink dries affix the pigment to the paper. This is analogous to paint drying on a wall. A film forms that locks the pigment in place. Paper's slight roughness helps by giving the ink film something to grip. Drying for inks on paper can be by absorption into the matrix, evaporation of a solvent, or oxidation for oil-based inks. Oftentimes, it's a combination. For instance, ballpoint ink on notebook paper. The paper absorbs the ink's oils, leaving the dyes on, just below the surface. A resin in the ink may help attach those dyes to the paper fibers, and the rest simply stays put once the solvent is gone. Additionally, many inks physically stain the cellulose. That is, the colorant actually penetrates the fiber and remains even if the surface is lightly washed, though vigorous washing may pull it out. Skin. If you draw on your skin with a pen, the ink is just sitting on the outermost layer, the epidermis. Skin is slightly oily and moist, which can make ink adhesion tricky. Water-based inks can bead up or wipe off from oils and sweat. Most pen inks will adhere temporarily because as the solvent, water or oil, evaporates, the dye, pigment, and binder deposit on the skin's surface. But because the epidermis constantly regenerates and sheds, and because washing with soap can remove the inks, many dyes are water-soluble, or soaps can dissolve the binder. Writing on skin is not permanent. In contrast, tattoo ink is inserted past the epidermis into the dermis. There, it isn't exposed to the outside world or surface shedding. The ink particles become embedded among dermal collagen fibers and are engulfed by cells, macrophages. The reason the color stays in place is that the pigment particles are too large for lymphatic vessels to carry away easily, so they mostly remain where deposited. Some do get taken up to lymph nodes, but most stay put, causing the permanent mark. Over years, tattoos can fade, as the body's immune system very slowly breaks down or disperses the pigments, or UV light degrades them. The adherence in tattoos is thus more mechanical entrapment than chemical bonding. The body forms a thin layer of scar tissue around the pigment granules, locking them under the skin. It's worth noting that henna, a temporary body ink, works by a different mechanism. Henna dye, lazone, actually penetrates the epidermis and binds to keratin, staining the skin cells in the top layer. As those cells naturally slough off over 1-3 weeks, the stain fades. So henna is a dye that chemically attaches to skin protein, but only in the superficial layer. Fabric. Fabrics, textiles, vary. Cotton is absorptive and hydrophilic. Polyester is smooth and hydrophobic, etc. For inks on fabric, the approach depends on the chemistry of the fiber. When using pigment-based textile inks, like in screen printing a t-shirt, the ink typically has a binder that, upon curing, heat or air dry, forms a plastic matrix that encases the fibers at the surface. The pigment is held in that matrix, often an acrylic polymer, which physically clings to the fabric by mechanical interlocking and some van der Waals forces. The roughness of the fiber helps the cured ink grab on. Good textile inks are formulated to flex with the fabric and not crack, while still surviving washes. They often require a heat cure to fully cross-link the binder for durability. When using dyes on fabric, like in dyeing or direct-to-fabric printing with dye-based inks, the ideal is for the dye to chemically bond or strongly adsorb to the fiber. Reactive dyes, as mentioned, form covalent bonds with cotton, cellulose, essentially becoming part of the fiber. Acid dyes bond ionically or via hydrogen bonding to amino groups in wool, silk, or nylon. Dispersed dyes literally dissolve into synthetic fibers like polyester, lodging in the fiber's molecular structure, like a dye diffusing into plastic. In all these cases, once the dye is fixed, it's not just a surface layer, It's in the fiber. That's why a properly dyed fabric can be washed repeatedly without the color fully coming out, though some unfixed excess will wash out initially. Sublimation inks for polyester are a neat case. The printed solid dye on paper, when heated, turns to gas, which penetrates polyester fibers and then redeposits inside them as solid when cooled. The result is a very vibrant, virtually non-hand feel print that is part of the fabric, common in sportswear prints. Inks on fabrics also have to deal with flexibility and porosity. A cotton shirt will soak a water-based ink and cause it to spread, wicking along fibers. So printing detailed images on cotton often uses either a thickened ink pigment with binder or pre-treating the fabric to prevent wicking, e.g., coating it or using a viscosity modifier. Textile ink adhesion is tested by wash tests. A good ink should not significantly fade or crack after many laundry cycles. Achieving that means ensuring either strong bonding, dye fiber chemical bonds, or a durable coating pigment binder that withstands water and detergents, plastics, and other non-porous surfaces. Printing or writing on plastic, metal, or glass is challenging because these surfaces are smooth and often hydrophobic, especially many plastics. So ink can bead up or flake off if not formulated right. Two factors are key: surface wetting and binder adhesion. For a liquid ink to adhere, it must first wet the surface, meaning the ink's surface tension must be lower than the surface energy of the substrate. Plastics like polyethylene or polypropylene have low surface energy. They're waxy, so normal ink might just bead, high contact angle. To address this, either the ink is given a very low surface tension, using aggressive solvents or surfactants so it can spread, or the plastic is pre-treated, e.g., corona or plasma treatment, which bombards the surface to create polar groups, raising its surface energy. In industrial printing, it's common to have a corona treater on a plastic film press so that the ink will properly wet and stick. Next, once it wets and is deposited, the binder and the ink must form a film that clings to the surface. Solvent-based inks for plastic essentially work by slightly dissolving or etching the plastic surface and depositing resin into it. For example, screen printing inks for PVC or acrylic often contain solvents like ketones or aromatics that soften the surface, allowing the ink's resin, say an acrylic or vinyl resin, to grab on as it dries. When the solvent evaporates, the resin pigment film is interlocked with the surface. On a molecular level, you get van der Waals forces and perhaps some covalent bonding if the resin can react. Not common on inert plastics, but on glass, metal, special epoxy, or silane inks can chemically bond. UV curable inks used on plastics take a different approach. They have monomers that polymerize under UV light to form a solid plastic that physically adheres. If well formulated, the polymer might form covalent bonds to a surface, especially glass or metal if a coupling agent is present. But usually it's mechanical, physical adhesion. These inks cure almost instantly and lock onto the surface topography. Permanent markers, Sharpies, etc., use solvent-based dye inks that can write on many surfaces, including plastic. They contain solvents like alcohols or xylene that help the ink bite into a plastic surface slightly, depositing water-insoluble dyes. The dye may also stain the plastic if it can penetrate slightly. The resin in the marker ink, often a silicone or acrylic resin, ensures that once the solvent evaporates, a water-resistant film remains. On some very slick plastics, even Sharpie can smear off because the surface is too inert. In those cases, physically roughing the surface or using a specialty paint marker with a paint-like opaque pigment ink works better. In summary, adhesion to non-porous surfaces often requires engineered inks or surface pretreatment. If you see printing on a glossy plastic package, know that either the ink was made for that material with appropriate binders, solvents, and likely cured quickly, or the material was pre-treated to accept the ink. Without those, the ink would just sit on top and could easily scratch off. Finally, regardless of surface, once an ink's liquid part evaporates or is absorbed, the remaining solid dye is bonded to substrate or pigment bound in a solidified binder is what constitutes the ink mark. The durability of that mark depends on the strength of attachment. On paper, the attachment is within fibers and somewhat on the surface. Decent, but paper can be abraded or soaked. On skin, superficial ink isn't attached well and comes off with washing. Tattoo ink is essentially trapped under new skin growth. On fabric, dyes can be truly attached, bonded internally, making them very wash fast. Or pigments can be glued to the surface, which might crack if the glue fails. On plastic, metal, glass, one often needs a glue-like approach, resin, or actual chemical bonding to prevent the ink from just peeling or scratching off. Understanding these interactions is crucial in both selecting the right ink for a job and in developing new inks. For instance, printable electronics require conductive ink that sticks to flexible plastic without cracking when bent, a big adhesion challenge being actively researched. Learn more about art, history, and music at oransbooks.com. Please like and subscribe, and may the rest of your life be the best of your life. Oran Z. Belgrave.